Thank you. It's wonderful to be here in Christiania to talk about consciousness. I think the place is really appropriate. Going to talk about the mind, the soul, spirit, and I think it's one of the biggest mysteries science is trying to tackle right now. It's understanding how each and every one here is actually experiencing the world around us, and also our internal world. And it's a challenge because nobody really knows what consciousness is, how it comes about. It used to be the field of philosophy, religion, and now I think because we have these new machines where we can measure what's going on in the brain, that has changed. So the tests you just saw in the video were not really developed by us. We're looking at the brain, and historically, that used to be different. This is a picture from the Book of Deaths, where a couple of millennia ago, ancient Egypt, and what you see here is this balance where it's the heart that's being measured, trying to capture the soul. And, well, the brain was actually just thrown away. We had to wait until Andreas Vesalius, one of the founding fathers of anatomy, to be a little bit more precise and to actually follow the scientific method, to confront our theories, thinking, with actual observation. So what he did in Brussels, 16th century, was cutting open the bodies of these, well, prisoners and those who were punished and died. And he saw that all the nerves in the body went through the brain, and he said, well, that must be an important organ. And it took a couple of centuries for us to really be able to zoom in to that wonderful organ, the brain. You each have, I hope, one with you. In your brains, there's a lot of cells, neurons. And the first who could actually see these cells, the microscope, was Ramon y Cajal. He was also a great, he could make very beautiful drawings, and your brain cells are different from all the other cells in your body because they're highly connected. This is what makes your neurons so special. They are communicating with tens of thousands of other neurons. And now, of course, we have these machines, and we can make pictures of your brain and how your brain is functioning. And we see these yellow blobs, and we can get all excited, try to understand consciousness, to read your minds, and then, of course, to make clinical sense of it, because I'm not only a scientist, but also a neurologist seeing patients, trying to translate this research into real clinical settings. And of course, as a neurologist, I'm supposed to know what consciousness is. And when I'm in front of a patient and I claim he's unconscious, how do I do that? In the absence of a definition that's universally accepted of consciousness. Well, first of all, we would like the patient to be alive. So then there's a challenge to define life and death. So how do we do that? Well, we can ask the patient. And to illustrate this, I'd like to share one quite exceptional consultation of a patient who was sent to us by a colleague in England. And secretary is calling me saying, oh, Dr. Laureys, you need to come now because the patient arrived and he's saying he's dead, which is quite unusual. And there he is saying, I'm dead. I say, well, not sure I agree because you're there and you're talking to me. And he says, no, my brain is dead. And he tells his story, his wife left him. He was very depressed, filled the bath with water, stepped in with the hairdryer, and actually nothing happened, because now electricity has made some improvements, and he just actually stepped out of the bath. Nothing happened, intact, yet convinced he was dead. And he spent, well, you're laughing, but he didn't, feel great. He was walking around the graveyard, didn't eat, didn't brush his teeth. Maybe one positive thing, he quit smoking. He said, I'm dead, no use. And of course, this story, which is one way to, discuss about something that's not so funny, which is a reality for each and every one of us. We're all going to die. And obviously, he was not dead. He had what we call Cotard syndrome. It's a disease known by psychiatrists where, you're very depressed and you're convinced you're dead. And this permits me to then ask the question, well, what is that exactly? And I think we all know what that is, and we've seen it, maybe. It's not a diagnosis where, as a medical doctor, you like to get it wrong. Medicine is not a science, where the diagnosis we make often suffer from some degree of uncertainty. Yet when we say the patient is dead, we really don't want to get it wrong and have them come afterwards to the consultation. And this actually is illustrated here in this cartoon where Carnish-Kernicki, 19th century, made a little fortune renting these devices, where, depending on your budget, you can rent this, and when you were buried down under, you could sign and make wiggle this little flag. There's a bell ringing, and this glass bulb that you would break, saying, oh, made a mistake, I'm not dead yet. There's no statistics how many souls were saved, but yet it was quite a good business for Mount Carnish-Kernicki. It illustrates how we all have historically this kind of fear of, what death is, and that medical doctors wouldn't get it wrong. And actually, it's quite simple. You're dead when your heart stops beating for good, you stop breathing, and your brain stops working. These are the three vital functions. And when one stops, the other will also fail. Okay? And then, actually, here in Copenhagen, a new invention, the artificial respirator. And that really was a revolution. It forced society, medicine, to redefine death. It was the beginning of a new discipline, intensive care medicine. It was the beginning also of this all-ethical reflection about therapeutic abstinency, futility. Because now, for the first time, patients after a traumatic brain injury, where basically the whole brain was gone, with this machine could still breathe. And so the heart kept beating, and this was also the source of a lot of questioning. When can we stop this machine? And especially in Italy, this new discipline now, intensive care physicians, felt uncomfortable to stop this machine, and so they went to see the Pope. Pius XII, you see him here in action. And they asked the question, can we stop this machine? The Pope said two things. First, you got your job, I got mine. Death, it's a medical diagnosis. That's your business. It's for you to define what death is. And second, if you feel that there's no reasonable hope, then you shouldn't feel morally obliged to keep the machine going. So very progressive, 1950s, the acceptance of therapeutic abstinency. When your treatment is futile, has no sense, you can stop it. And that's important, because we should all know what death is, and basically for each and every one of us here, there's two ways that you can be diagnosed death. The classical way, your heart and lungs stop functioning for good, or if you happen to be in intensive care with this machine designed here in Copenhagen, you can be diagnosed brain death, the death of the brain. And it's important to be very clear about that, because sometimes in the media we hear miracle stories of people, giving interviews after being dead. That is always wrong. Sometimes the term clinical death is being used, and people say, I was clinically dead. And I don't like this term because there's the word death in there, and you can only die once. James Bond was wrong. And since the 1950s, since we have these criteria of brain death, never ever a patient who truly showed them regained consciousness. So you can be relaxed about that one. Despite the fact that some, books and documentaries, including this one from the BBC with a very sexy title, Transplants, Are the Donors Really Dead? Well, yes, they are. So clinical death is not death. Clinical death is just someone where the heart stops beating, and we now know that many of these can be resuscitated, okay? It's not when your heart stops beating. It needs to be irreversible, and we have very specific criteria. So brain death is death. And I think that this image kind of captures it all. So we made this image with this machine. It's a positron emission tomography. It's historically the first one where we can actually see the brain in action. So if we would make one image in your brain right now, it should look like this, I hope, for each and every one here. It's yellow, red, a lot of activity. When we inject radioactive sugar, your brain cells are the cells in your body that use the most of energy. And this is what we see. Okay? On this scale, it's all very, very active. Right? I'll try to keep you up there during the rest of the talk. This is what we see in brain death. It's the so-called empty skull sign. It's black. All those billions of neurons are silent, are dead. Only if we really pump up the volume, see we some activity in the skin surrounding the skull. So here, you can safely donate your organs. By the way, who is registered as an organ donor here tonight? That's good, but it can be better. So think about it. And I think it is very useful to actively enroll as a donor. This is what we see in Coma. You see, it's not brain death. It's not a normal brain either. This is a patient who, for example, had a cardiac arrest, was resuscitated, survived, but was comatose. Colors are all blue. We are at a brain that's functioning at about half of normal values, okay? Some of these patients afterwards come back and tell us these wonderful stories. Doctor, I was nearly dead. I saw this light. I saw my own body. I felt great. The media love it. Lots of books, lots of documentaries, very little science. This might well be one of the first artistic depictions. Hieronymus Bosch, you see this notion of light, tunnel, angels meeting with other beings. Also seems that there's some cultural component here. I was last year in India, and they more often will talk about this light as a kind of river. Muslim countries more adore. So very interesting, and I think receiving way too little attention from the scientific community. I don't know if anyone here ever had a near-death experience, drug-induced or not. But for us, it's very interesting. So if you had, please share it with us, okay? It helps us. It helps to test our hypothesis. One of the very early studies testing a hypothesis was what you can read here, New York Times, 1907. Dr. McDougall, soul has weight. So he said, if the soul, the mind, consciousness exists, it must have a weight. And if you die, the soul leaves the body, you will lose weight. So he had a deal with a nursing home where he would put dying people on this huge weighting device, and he was the one making the diagnosis. Now he's dead. His companion would look at the needle, 21 grams. He published, after a couple of cases, his results. He also killed quite a number of dogs. They didn't lose any weight, so no souls for the dogs. The study was never replicated, and as you know, in science, it's not one experiment that is having the absolute truth. So no, consciousness so far has not been weighted. But I like the idea of here, this physician, confronting what he was thinking with actual observations. Now, modern neuroscience, since then, of course, made quite some progress. And as I said, many of these people tell us, I saw my own body. And to me, it's interesting that we can actually provoke these out-of-body experiences by stimulating this part of the brain, the right temporoparietal, and maybe this could help us to solve this fascinating and yet not well understood phenomenon of near-death experiences. So far, we have over 400 persons who shared with us at the University of Liège their experience. Well, it's good to know that they all felt quite good about it. So about 90% says it was great. Next, about 80%, this very interesting, fascinating sensation of watching your own body. So here we're trying to make a top 10 of the most frequent features of the so-called near-death experience. And we're also trying to find out whether the cause, whether it's a cardiac arrest and maybe just lack of oxygen to some parts of the brain could explain it. In this study, led by Vanessa Charland, it doesn't seem to explain the whole phenomenon. So we keep doing this by all possible means, looking at what I think the physiological reality is of near-death experience. And again, if you had one, know someone, please share it with us. But now, really our main core of activities at the University Hospital is trying, by all means, to answer this difficult question: is the patient considered comatose, conscious in any way? And that is difficult because consciousness needs to be shared. And by definition, a coma patient can't speak or can't answer by any sign language. It's actually the same problem when faced with the question, are newborns conscious? Or are here at the other end of life elderly, highly demented patients who no longer can communicate in any way conscious? And we tend to call these patients, unconscious or vegetative. And historically, I think we've been underestimating their cognitive capacities, the possibility of them, some of them having some subjective experience and awareness. We did a couple of studies, including in collaboration here with the University of Copenhagen, showing that when we're not careful, patients who survive coma awaken, yet are considered vegetative, because all the movements they make are considered as reflexive. If we're not conscious, in about a third of the patients, we might miss some minimal signs of consciousness. And of course, the first challenge is to define what are we talking about. So when at the bedside, we're trying to quantify consciousness, how do we do it? We can't just be philosophers saying, well, I don't know what it is. We will reduce this complexity to two main factors. So, okay, we need a volunteer. Jay. Yeah, the sound man there. One can ask the question, is Jay conscious? Okay. When the patient says he's conscious, that's a good start. Now, as said, in intensive care, it's not that simple, and we will reduce the problem of consciousness to two dimensions. First, we'll make sure that he's awake, okay? Because when you're asleep, you lose awareness of what's happening around you. And that's very simple. We'll just make sure he's having eyes wide open. If not, we'll stimulate him. If not, I will go there and squinch his finger. So that looks good, okay? Eyes wide open. Yet, is he aware? And there, our consciousness test is very simple. We'll just ask him to do something. Raise your left arm. Okay? I can tell you, for those who couldn't see it, he did it. However, what if we ask him the question, raise your arm, and he doesn't? Did we really prove he is unconscious? No. Because, yes, knowing him, maybe he doesn't feel like moving his arm. No, he isn't. But yes, that's a problem. Actually, I remember a woman who afterwards told me, Dr. Laureys, I remember you asking me, squeeze my hand, look to the ceiling. I just couldn't see any reason why. This so-called akinetic mutism is really a challenge for us. But there's other problems with our consciousness test. Maybe he's paralyzed, right? Maybe his brain says, move, move, but after accident, he got a lesion, damage to his nerves, spinal cord, brainstem, and his brain no longer controls his muscles, right? That's a big problem. Maybe he's deaf, so we'll write it down. So it's very important to emphasize that our clinical measure of consciousness can be biased because we're making inferences from a motor response, eye-opening response to command. We also should emphasize that historically we're thinking about consciousness as all or nothing. You know, he's conscious or he's not. Well, we should rather think, as you see here, in kind of 50 shades of gray. He can be more or less awake, he can be more or less aware, right? Now, I like this definition of consciousness because it's very straightforward. It's what every night each and every one of us experiences. When you fall asleep, I hope not during this lecture, but it can happen, one point you will lose awareness of what's happening around you, of what I'm saying. The same holds for pharmacological coma or anesthesia. You know, you're given drugs, you fall asleep, you lose consciousness of your external world. Now, in 1970s, there was a new entity defined, persistent vegetative state. I don't like the term. We now call these patients in a non-responsive wakefulness, because that's it what we see. They awaken, open the eyes, start breathing, start moving, but everything seems to be a reflex. They will never answer to a simple command. So we have this dissociation. They look awake or aroused, yet they fail the consciousness test. And then in about 2000, there was still another entity defined, minimally conscious state. This really is a problem for us. Already this is. We're not used to see patients who are sitting there just like you, eyes wide open, yet fully unconscious, okay? It's just like brain death. It's very hard when I see a family explaining, you know, your son or wife had this accident and she's dead, where the patient is lying in bed, heart is beating, she's breathing through the machine, she's feeling warm. It's not the idea we have about death. Seeing a patient who's so-called vegetative or unresponsive also, it's not what we're used to seeing. A patient, eyes wide open and yet unconscious. And minimally conscious, the challenge there is that we know that sometimes they are a little bit conscious. Yet we can't communicate with them. We can't have access to this consciousness. And it will also fluctuate. You can examine the patient. Now he would pass the consciousness test, and an hour later it's gone. Very, very frustrating. Or they would smile when the mother is in the room, and that's it. That's the only thing you have. Wouldn't smile to other people. Can't say it's a reflex, but it's very limited. What should we do with these patients? And then there's patients in a so-called locked-in syndrome. These people are fully awake and aware, but paralyzed. You know? They survive their coma, they feel and see and hear everything, but they can't move anything except small movements of the eye. And this is their only way to communicate, yes, I'm still in there. This is a video of such a patient. You see him here blinking with his eyes. You see the scar of the artificial respirator, tracheotomy. You would stimulate him, he would make decerebration movements. Yet, this infrared camera will capture the movements of one eye, and he will use these movements to control a cursor and click on the different letters, go on the internet, write poetry, chat. So clearly, this patient with a lesion in the brainstem, the brain no longer controls the muscles of the body, but this camera offers him a way, of course, to communicate, control his environment, and significantly improves his quality of life. So this is a very extreme case of how consciousness and motor activity are two different things. So, we shouldn't just rely on motor activity when at the bedside we try to measure consciousness. We should use these machines. I already showed you the PET scan where we use radioactivity and see what's active in the brain. Now we have functional MRI. This machine will make pictures of the brain, but also will look at how it's actually functioning. And the brain, of course, is an electrical organ. So again, we can put a lot of electrodes, in this case, this kind of the Rolls-Royce of EEG, over 250, and we can see how the brain is functioning, how it reacts to stimuli, how it reacts when we ask questions. We can also stimulate the brain with very strong magnets and see what happens. And so in our center and all laboratories over the world now, we're using this to better understand brain activity and trying, in our case, to use this for patients after coma where the diagnosis is not really sure, the prognosis, the chance of recovery is not really sure. And one of the first questions we asked was whether there's a relationship between consciousness and activity in your brain. So, this is your brain, 100%. This is brain death, 0%. Now, what's happening in sleep? Tonight, when you will fall asleep, in deep sleep, your brain will be showing a very low activity. The colors are much intense. It's about 60% of normal. And then towards the morning, when you might be dreaming in rapid eye movement sleep, REM sleep, you may look like unconscious sleeping, yet you're having these very vivid dreams. Your brain will be very active. And when we make you unconscious with anesthetics, again, brain activity will drop. We stop the drug, consciousness returns, and full 100%. So here it looks like, yes, there's kind of a threshold maybe. If you fall below, you're unconscious. Well, the study of coma and coma survivors shows us that's not the case. When we look at these people, when they're unconscious and when they recover, we see it's only part of the brain that recovers. In other words, you don't need your whole brain to be conscious. There's a network, and we know where it is. You see it here. It's colored. We can actually see a network for external awareness. So this is everything you see and feel coming through your senses. It's perceptual, sensory. It's in the front, the back of both hemispheres. External awareness network. And then there's internal awareness or self-conscious, a little voice talking to yourself right now probably, I need a drink. This is internal, in blue. Mental imagery, you're daydreaming, thinking about your holidays, whatever. So there's two networks, external awareness, internal awareness. And what is important is how these networks and these neurons are connected. This is the black arrows. One neuron can't be conscious. The strength of your brain is the complexity of these thousands of billions of interactions. And of course, we will test this in pharmacological coma or anesthesia, in normal changes like sleep, but also hypnosis. Very interesting, where one can alter, without taking drugs, how we perceive the world. And then we use that knowledge to try and reduce the uncertainty about the diagnosis and the prognosis in our patients. And we'll use all these machines, all these tests in the hospital, and then those complicated calculations looking at different regions of the brain. In this case, we talk to the patient, we see what's activating, and then we can do mathematics and help doctors to make the right decision. And that's important. It's important for many reasons. One of them is that when your brain is still showing a little bit of activity, when you're minimally conscious, you can perceive emotions, you can perceive pain. So this is what we showed when you apply noxious stimulation, so we basically gave electrical shocks in healthy volunteers, we looked what happened, and then in these patients, and they can't tell us, I feel pain, but their brain scans tell us when the whole brain activates that very probably they do, and so we should give painkillers. We also actually use these machines to communicate with some of these patients. This is very difficult to do. This slide is in French, because it's good for your brain to read a little bit, where it reads a normal volunteer and a patient who is in a so-called vegetative state. You see the brains? You see the difference. There's a lot of black here. This is fluid, because this is a young man who had a very severe traumatic brain injury. He came to our center, like many others. Every week, we use these machines to try and see if there's anything left in terms of brain activity. See, at some places, this is a normal brain. Here, there's basically no gray matter, no cortex left. And then we did something quite strange. We asked these patients, well, imagine playing tennis. Why do we do that? Well, actually, it's the same question, same type of approach we used when we were asking the question, is Jay conscious? So we would put him in the MRI machine and would ask him, move. We wouldn't look at his muscles, but we would look at his cortex, at his motor cortex, and if he truly imagines to move, he will activate this part of the brain. And we can then use that in patients with very severe injuries to the brain, and sometimes we got a surprise. Sometimes we think the patient, no way to communicate, no response to any of the questions, but in the machine, we see that the brain lights up to specific questions, and then we can use that, ask them questions, and read in their brain, he's saying yes, or he's saying no. And this is exactly what we did. It was the first case, it works, the technology exists, but it's still terribly difficult, expensive, and we need cheaper and portable tools. These are so-called brain-computer interfaces. It's the same thing. Now you put electrodes, you ask a question. Again, it's in French, it's good for your brain plasticity. Bougez le pied, move your foot. Bougez la main, move your hand. We don't look at your foot, at your hand, but you look at the activity of your motor cortex. And sometimes we can get surprise results, and of course that changes the way we will clinically deal with the patient. Just to show us how ingenious scientists can be, this study communicates by looking at your pupil. So this is my daughter Clara. She's a teenager. It's not always easy to communicate with her. And here I put a camera, infrared camera, on her pupil, and I can ask her a question. As-tu mal? Are you in pain? If you want to say no, now calculate 24 times 57. 24 times 57. It's not so easy. If you truly try it, you will stress a little bit and your pupil will dilate. I can easily pick that up with a camera and we can communicate without you moving any muscle. But it takes some time and it's not yet plug and play. And there's still a big problem with all these fancy tests. Imagine playing tennis 24 times 57, and that is... Come on, Christiania. That's very good, you're conscious. The problem is, for all these tests to work, you don't need your muscles, but you still need to understand the question, okay? So patients who wouldn't understand language, who are, we say, aphasic, aren't unconscious, okay? And they would still fail all these tests. So we've been putting a lot of effort in developing tests where we don't need any understanding of language. And the simplest thing we can do is just putting the person in an MRI scan and hit the record button. So let's take again our favorite subject. Question is he conscious? We'll put him in an MRI and then see what happens. Well, what will happen is that he will be thinking. We can't help it. We always think. Okay? I met some Buddhist monks who claim they can think of nothing, but personally, I never succeeded. Our brain was, over those millions of years, made very good at creating some subjective experience. And this is exactly the thing we will use. When you're in that machine thinking, we can read out your brain signals and then decode it, okay? And try to read your thoughts. And this is what you see here. This is a healthy volunteer in an MRI thinking. And we see these yellow blobs, his internal awareness network lighting up. And we can use it in patients after coma. And sometimes we think they're unconscious, and when we see these yellow blobs, we get all excited. We think we see consciousness. Well, actually, we should be careful. And sometimes it can be a Pinocchio. It can be an artifact. It can be noise from the scanner. It can be noise coming from some movement. And this is very tricky and very difficult because we have no gold standards. Okay? How can we know for sure? It's different when we're doing research on brain cancer. We can check the test, look under a microscope, there is a cancer cell or not. Here it's very difficult. We can't, even after death, it's even more difficult to find consciousness. So, we're looking at the problem by all possible ways and machines, and one of the last ones we developed, this consciousness test will actually stimulate, hit part of your brain with this magnet. And at the same time, with these electrodes that capture the electrical activity, we will see how this perturbation changes the activity. And when you're unconscious, the change will be very stereotypical, always the same, no complexity. When you're conscious, or when your brain has the capacity for consciousness, and actually what we're doing here is testing a specific theory for consciousness called information integration theory, we can put a number on consciousness. This is a little bit ambitious, probably overly arrogant, but still, we're optimistic, naively, that we can put a number on consciousness. It goes from 0 to 1. Every time you're conscious, it's above 33%. And when you're comatose or anesthetized or deep sleep, the number falls below. And this will work even in Jay, even if he is not feeling like participating, or if he's paralyzed, or if he's deaf, or if he's blind, any condition, this will still work. You don't understand language, it will still work. So we think this is useful, and we now use it in each and every patient we see in the hospital. So of course, better understanding can possibly help us better treating. And one of the early studies showed that there are specific connections in your brain that recover. These red arrows you see between parts of the brain in red and this deep structure called the thalamus, whatever, and we could identify specifically in here which parts were important, which helped to put electrodes deep in there. This is called deep brain stimulation, was done in New York, and this helps some patients. It's again, research tool. It's invasive, it's not without risk, but we can now turn on these connections in the awareness networks. In Liège, we've been developing a lot so-called non-invasive stimulation. So this is trying to do the same, electrically stimulating your brain, but in this case, we just put electrodes. And then for 20 minutes, we put the current every day, stimulating this part here, the front, and again, some patients, after severe damage to the brain, can be helped by these new technologies. So, coming to the end of this talk, and the question of what are we going to do with all of this, and trying to make the best possible sense. And of course, we want to avoid scenarios like this one, okay? We can do many things. The question is, should we do everything in all situations? And these new tests and machines are helping us to make the best decision for the specific patient, trying not to fall in the trap of therapeutic futility. But in the end, we're trying to offer these patients a life worth living. And that is very difficult. It's difficult to measure consciousness, it's difficult to measure pain, it's also very difficult to measure quality of life. And yet, that's what it's all about. So, we again, as scientists, try to put numbers on things, and this is what we did. We're trying to know what it is like to be a coma survivor unable to communicate, so-called minimally conscious state, but by definition, we can't ask them unless we use these new technologies, which we will see in the future more and more. But here, we asked patients who were locked in. So these patients, again, after a coma, can't move, in a bed, can't eat, can't care for themselves, but with their eyes, they can answer a question about how they feel. So we can do this together. Imagine the worst period in your life. This is -5. Okay, can you do that? Worst period in your life. Somebody died, divorce, or a wedding. Okay, it's not good. -5, okay, worst. Now the best period in your life. A wedding, child born, moving into Christiania. +5, okay? Now you've calibrated your own quality of life scale, -5, +5, and I can ask you the question, how were you the past 2 weeks? -5, +5. How were you on this scale, from -5 to +5 on the past 2 weeks? 3.5. Wonderful. You need me to tell how you do it. This is similar to what locked-in syndrome patients tell us. +4, +3. So we shouldn't judge a book on its cover. Yes, you can be extremely motor handicapped. Actually, you cannot be more handicapped and still alive than these locked-in syndrome patients and still have a life worth living. Now, we also see, we did this study in France, where there's no law on euthanasia, yet we asked the question, do you want to go on living, or do you want euthanasia? And as you see, some patients felt miserable and also wanted to die in dignity, which is another big challenge. And I think it's important that there's no taboo about death and about the end of life. We should try to have a good discussion at the level of the whole society. I don't know here who wrote a living will. Whoa. Or identified a person who can tell your wishes when you no longer can, and it can happen quickly, maybe tonight or tomorrow. Brain injury, an accident, cardiac arrest. So this is important. We don't want to think about it, yet it helps us physicians. When you think about your values, and you're the only one who knows, it depends also on your religious beliefs and your philosophical convictions, but identify a person. It's better that it's someone who's a friend and who will not get any money when you die, but identify one person and tell him about your values. That can help us. So, I hope I've shown you some results illustrating how you need a brain to be conscious, how you need a specific consciousness network for you to be aware of what's happening around you, of your internal awareness. You remember those two, in blue, in red, with all the machines that can try to help us in very difficult cases sometimes in our hospitals. We're actually also, I mentioned it briefly, looking at other situations, not only anesthesia, but also hypnosis and meditation. This is Mathieu Ricard. He's the translator of the Dalai Lama. And he's, of course, very, very interesting for us because he can modify his level and content of consciousness. He's a brain athlete. He, for decades, actually he's a PhD from Institut Pasteur in Paris, so he's still a little bit of a scientist, but he made a career as a monk, and he's participating to all these scientific projects, not the ones you saw in the initial video, but the ones using neuroimaging, trying to test our different hypotheses. Well, I just want to thank all the people who did the studies I had the pleasure to present tonight, and thank you for your attention.